Hey everyone. So thank you very much for joining us today. All right, today's talk is kind of an extension of what we were speaking about last week with mechanism design. But this time we're going to talk a little bit more practically about how you can deploy this in the systems you're building. And another component of that, which is what you might call slicing the pie, which is related and almost equally important. If you get it wrong, you're in real trouble. But we can get into that. Okay, so designing token reward systems. The first step is to slice the pie somehow. Your token supply will be in most cases limited in some form, or at least it will start with a limit. And how you decide to allocate the tokens inside that stack, if you will essentially define the future of your project. If you mess this up, frankly, you won't have enough tokens to support adoption activities of your product or protocol before it becomes properly decentralized, and you will find it difficult to get traction in the market. But if you do it well, you can end up in the opposite position. You can end up in the situation where you have this kind of secret weapon that no one can really that other competitors or anyone else or even Web 2 companies, they just can't compete with it. It's very, very powerful. So there's a lot at stake to get this right. There's also a lot of variation in how these things look, depending on project to project. And to some extent, also this has shifted over time in the industry. I would say with your token allocation table, which is what we will generally call this, you want to make it boring. Unless there's a really good reason, you want to make sure that everything in this thing is just, people are going to look at it and go, oh, I guess that's fine, and then move on with their lives, right? This thing can basically only bring you problems, more or less. Again, unless you've got some like a fantastic idea, which is one in very few. It can more or less only bring you problems from the point of view of like fundraising or bringing in other team members or whatever it happens to be. So just try and keep it simple and plain and in line with industry expectations. And yeah, make sure you try and maximize the pool of tokens you have for rewards for people using the system one way or another. But we're going to kind of get to that in a second. So when you go through the fundraising cycle to get capital to build out your project, perhaps at the end of the foundry, you're going to obviously need more capital to hire maybe a few more team members, this kind of thing. The token allocation table, to be frank, the token allocation table is, at least when the market is functioning sensibly, a big part of that, right? Because it's what specifies, frankly, whether the project is aimed towards long-term success or whether there's going to be an overemphasis on the short term, all of this kind of thing. So we saw a lot of projects to give a bad example or an example of when this goes badly. We saw a lot of projects in the 2017, 2018 era that allocated about 90% of the token supply for sales immediately. And what that meant was, well, 90% of the tokens are gone before the product's even been built, which actually makes absolutely no sense. You want to incentivize the founding team and the team around them, and even the investors. You want to incentivize them by long-term success of a project. And so actually making sure that the tokens kind of sit with the people that produce value for the period of time is a very sensible way or a sensible principle to employ. But there's kind of more detail there. So here's a general structure that you can use to make sure that you're not being wildly off base. And you'll have to modify this. Investors, everyone's got an opinion basically on this, and there is no hard and fast rule, but there are kind of generalized or generally accepted structure in the industry, and that's what we're trying to present here. Like, you will have to modify it a bit, but it should be good enough to start. So the first thing, founder allocations. How many tokens should you and your co-founders get? Typically between 8 to 15%. There's an interesting thing here that happens where people tend to want the founders to have less, but I would actually argue I would be happier looking at your token allocation tables if you had a little bit more on the higher end of this spectrum. And the reason for that is pretty simple. During the early stage of your startup, there are going to be times where you have to get out of bed at like 3 a.m. in the morning every single day for months to try and fix something that's broken or deal with immense amounts of pressure and stress. This is just part of the job of starting a startup. And you need to be appropriately incentivized to do that. Otherwise, you're not going to do it. And if you don't do it, no one else will. So the success of the project also kind of revolves around making sure that the founders are appropriately incentivized. Lockup. This is super, super important. Yes, that being true, that you need to be properly incentivized by the the value that you could get out of the thing you're building. You also need to be properly incentivized to be, if you will, locked to the outcomes of the project over a long period of time. Typical venture capital structure, which no one will argue about, it's very boring. Boring is good. Is 25% per year for 4 years. At Arwe, for what it's worth, I took a 20% over 5-year vesting schedule, and that started after we launched the product, which was about a year in. But that's on the higher end. You don't have to do that. But frankly, the longer that you lock your tokens into the success of the project, the better a signal that it gives. Okay, team allocations. Make sure you put aside around 10 to 20%, something like this, for the team. And you're going to want to allocate this in a kind of exponentially decaying curve as new people join the team. So at the beginning, it takes a lot of trust and faith in you as the founders for people to quit their jobs and turn down other opportunities and join you on this crazy mission that you're all on now. So giving slightly larger amount of tokens at the beginning makes more sense. And also there's another component of this, which is that generally the people at the start end up having a sort of exponentially greater effect as an individual person on the outcomes of the project than people at the end. So you can think of this as like, imagine the third person to join a team. Obviously, they're going to have a big impact because every single person, every single person hour at that time has a huge effect on the outcome for the project. Whereas if you're the 2000th person to join the team, reality is that you sort of you might have a small effect, but mostly you just you're amortized out, if you will. So it doesn't matter too much, and subsequently you're going to end up with less ownership of the thing you're building. So you wanted to allocate this over time on an exponentially decaying curve. In the traditional equity ecosystem, they have a system whereby you essentially mint more equity over time. So you're diluting people in subsequent rounds. And this is actually, so crypto has decided not to do this, but and we typically have fixed static token supplies. I think probably taking our cue from Bitcoin. But I wouldn't necessarily say that this is better. The problem is, however, when you speak to investors in crypto, they're thinking about the world from this sort of Bitcoin-centric mindset that says that that's the way things should work. And when this comes to team allocations, it means that you now have to make sure that you get this right from the beginning, because you can't mint more tokens in the future to allocate to the team. Whereas, of course, when you have equity rounds, you might essentially just have a board resolution to mint more tokens, in this case, equity shares, or actually stock option plans typically, to give to people. And so if you underestimate the amount of tokens that you might need at the beginning, then there's always the ability to add more later. In crypto, you don't necessarily get that. So this is a risk factor, running out of tokens for the team supply. Okay, team lockup. This is even more standard. I really wouldn't push your team to take anything more than a 4-year, 25% per year lockup. For what it's worth, there should also be a cliff after the first 12 months. So you don't give any tokens to people that haven't been with the team for more than 12 months. And then, there's some debate, and it sort of varies from implementation to implementation, but some people do linear vesting after that. So for each day, you work out, when the person leaves for whatever reason, you work out the number of days they've been there, and then you divide that by the number of days in 4 years, and then you say, okay, you have this proportion of the tokens that we put aside for you in this agreement. but also some people like to, yeah, also do it on a kind of yearly basis. And there's a lot of, I know, a lot of debate around it, but as long as you've got that 12-month cliff in there, I think that's the really important thing. One, yeah, okay, we can get to that a little later. Okay, yeah, really interesting underexplored area to look at is exponentially decaying vesting schedules. So the whole point of a vesting schedule is to incentivize people to stay with a project over a long period of time, because frankly, these things need dedication from people in order to work, at least at the beginning. Eventually, you should get a protocol out of it, which more or less runs itself, and for the reasons that we were speaking about in the mechanism design lecture. But at the beginning, at least, you need your team to be incentivized appropriately. And so one of the things you could try is having an exponentially decaying vesting curve. So the employee or the founder is never actually going to get their last tokens from the vesting schedule. But over time, they'll get like decreasingly few, tending towards zero. But at the same time, this being startups, if things are going well, the value of the startup should probably exponentially increase. And so, when you're at the 8-year point, there should be, if you use this system, hopefully, and I've never seen this done in practice. But at the beginning, I was talking about, unless you have a good idea for why you shouldn't do the boring thing, I would say this is one of the good ideas for why you might not want to do the boring thing. Never seen this done in practice, but this should mean that when you get to the 8-year point, well, there should be essentially more value likely to unlock in the future than right when you're at the beginning, just because the interaction between the exponentially increasing price, hopefully, and the exponentially decaying quantity released in the vesting schedule. This avoids the problem where Google, I think this was in the mid 2000s, this came about, people started wearing t-shirts that said like fully vested, right? So after they'd been at Google for 4 years, they just had all their Google stock, and they were like, they had enough money in life, they didn't care. And that's actually a really big problem. Like, you should never get to that situation. This is an obvious solution to that. Okay. Mining stroke usage rewards. This is really important, and it varies from project to project. If your users are going to be producing, like a good rule of thumb is just reward people proportionately to the value that they're going to create for the network. So if your users are going to be creating most of the value, then they should probably get most of the rewards. Bitcoin is obviously the most extreme version of this, where mining was 100% of the token supply. There was nothing else. And of course, Satoshi ended up owning, I think, around 11% of the token supply anyway, because that's the tokens that they mined. But nonetheless, the principle was fairer. Although I would also argue against the quote fair launch principles that you see in DeFi, because they're anything but fair. It's simply not the case that it is fair that the early users of the system, and in DeFi this is potentially liquidity providers, should gain all of the tokens, or the tokens at the cheapest point. And the team that built the project should get none. That's absolutely crazy. It's just not fair. The danger that comes from that is also that you will incentivize the projects and the teams behind those projects to find other ways of extracting value. And this is a real issue, because you've given them no incentive essentially by the thing they've created. So they have to find, if you will, a side channel attack to extract value from the system. And we saw this a lot during the DeFi summer last year. And I guess, yeah, still happens today, unfortunately. So I would just watch out for that one too. Okay, and token sales, I would say, kind of the rest, except do them over time, right? Don't sell all of the tokens upfront. Actually try and sell as little as you need to get yourself to the next point at which you'll have enough traction that it makes sense to fundraise again. Because of course, from the founders' points of view, it's not the worst time. If everything is going well, you're on an exponentially increasing token price curve, basically forever, theoretically, if everything goes well. That means that the worst time to sell tokens is basically always today, and tomorrow is a little bit less bad, right? You always want to push the token sales as far into the future as you can, but you also have to sort of weigh this against a countervailing force, which says, okay, the token markets are, for some reason, still massively correlated, even though actually nowadays the reality is that there are so many different asset types that there really shouldn't be any correlation between them. But whatever, they go up and down together, and you as the founder of one project can only influence that so much, actually like quite a small amount. And so you have to make sure that you have enough money to make your way to the next happy market cycle, if you will, happy part of the market cycle, rather than finding yourself in the bear market and needing to raise money, because you will have to part with more tokens then. And reality is, parting with more tokens means less token or less capital to invest in making the project better, and that's just it lowers the likely outcomes for the project. Okay, so hopefully that at least gives you some things to think about in terms of how to set up your token allocation table. For what it's worth, in the market cycle just passed, so this is 2021, if you're watching on YouTube, we saw really crazy things. Like in the peak of the hype cycle there, I spoke to founders, founders in our ecosystem, and I said, so how's it going with your token allocation table? Like, was it looking? What's the feedback you're getting? Expecting that this would become a big point of contention. And actually, in some of these cases, investors had never even asked for the token allocation table. In some cases, they hadn't even asked for the valuation at which they were raising. Just really crazy stuff. For what it's worth, I think the more due diligence an investor does, the higher the likelihood that they're going to be serious people that you want to work with over a long period of time. But we're going to have a whole different session, typically on fundraising. We try and tailor that session to the market, the point in the market cycle that we find ourselves in at that time. So it's actually been different every time so far that we've done a Foundry. And I'm sure this will be different than the last one. But anyway, we can get into all of that then. So now we can think about usage rewards. This is where mechanism design meets token allocations, right? So what are you going to do with the tokens that you have put aside for rewarding users in some form, or content creators, or whatever it happens to be? I think this is one of the least understood parts of crypto, or Web3 at least, is that we're going to be able to use these reward systems as a kind of secret weapon, if you will, to gain adoption in a way that Web2 companies will simply never be able to compete with, even if they want to. There's an interesting case in, I think, California right now. Uber has just recently won the right to give shares in Uber to drivers, either give them or sell them at a discounted rate or something like this, so that drivers can become owners of the platform. But it's taken them what, like 7 years or something to get to this point. And even now, that's only in California, and it's not for definite. Whereas in the token ecosystems, people have been giving tokens to the users of systems like from the beginning. Regulatory compliance pending. That's a great advantage if it can be done, because it means that you get users that are truly staked into the projects. So a quick overview of, I guess, the Web 2 versus Web 3 user acquisition cycles. So generally in Web 2, what happens is there's a company with founders and a CEO, and the founder or CEO, or both at the same time, occasionally goes to venture capitalists and says, hey, I want to raise some money so that I can grow the size of my business, right? And they give equity for dollars. Okay, cool. So now the company has diluted. Now the ownership structure, everyone that was on it before now owns a little bit less, and there are new people on the cap table, and but there's more dollars in the bank. And then there's a very simple equation that says, okay, so what is the customer acquisition cost? And we simply deploy this to gain users. We try and optimize it so that the customer acquisition cost is as low as possible and the lifetime value of those customers is as high as possible. And the interaction between these two factors more or less defines how effective the business is over time. In the early stages of Web2 startups, what tends to happen is that the venture capitalists, if you will, essentially bankroll the system. So the customer acquisition cost could be quite high even, but the lifetime value could be very low. So it could be objectively not profitable in the short term, with the idea that in the long term, it will be possible to extract value from those users one way or another. Typically, actually, after they've established a moat where the users can't leave or don't want to leave, because there's no alternative, and you can do that through all sorts of dubious methods like buying out the competition. There was a high-profile case of, it's funny, I can't even remember the name now, but there was a big video sharing website that Facebook bought back in 2017. They closed it in 2018, and there we go. Users still use Facebook when actually they were starting to move to this new platform, and we don't even remember the name of the old platform. So in the Web3 ecosystem, it's much different. Here, we can have a product which simply gives ownership of itself to users. So instead of going to VCs to convert that ownership into dollars or euros, whatever it happens to be, and then converting the euros into user acquisition, we can instead just give ownership directly to users. And this is better than, essentially just paying for them, because now they become staked into the ownership of your project. And so imagine if I'm using Community XYZ, right? The profit sharing community management dashboard built by Cedric in the community. And they have a reward system that each time I interact with one of the profit sharing communities I'm part of, I get a small number of XYZ tokens. Cool. So they could just pay me, or they could just put ads all over the internet, or the way that PayPal did it, for example. They just gave $10 to every account that wanted it, that was new. You could just do it that way. But if I get these XYZ tokens, and particularly if they're locked when I first get them, I'm kind of staked into the success of this thing. I think, oh, that's pretty cool. Right, like now I can vote on governance issues inside Community XYZ itself, confusingly in this case, Community XYZ on Community XYZ, but other projects don't have that confusion. And I am getting a share of the profit because these are profit sharing tokens over the time that I'm holding this thing. And I want to check in every now and again, just see how the project is doing. And I'm not just a user that has a kind of customer-like relationship with the product. Like I'm not just a kind of a passive accessor, like expecting it to do things for me and complaining when it doesn't. I'm actually a community member now. And this, crypto has a lot of dubious thoughts around, I would say, overuse of the word community. Really, community, as far as I can tell, is contributors, rather than just speculators, which is often what the crypto ecosystem defines it as. But when you have these people that have a stake in, for example, XYZ tokens, the likelihood that they're going to convert into contributors who are one way or another, either whether it's speaking about it in a positive fashion on Twitter, or whether it's telling their friends, or actually contributing code, or speaking about governance issues on the Discord server, whatever it happens to be, they're much more likely to become that kind of activated participant in this project that you're building, rather than a passive accessor of the service. And so that's super, super powerful. And it costs you the same amount, and it's actually easier because you don't have to, go raise money, which when this happens, the founders should expect that this is going to take typically 3 to 6 months, depending. And it'll be like 100% of your concentration. You're not going to get very much done in that time, unfortunately. So yeah, it offers really, really powerful advantages as a model. And essentially, you can use these tokens as your marketing budget. So you don't have to get dollars to pay for marketing. you just deploy the tokens directly themselves. And for a lot of the founders in the ecosystem, we see that there's a big skew towards technical focus rather than marketing focus. And we think that these token reward systems could be the kind of what's the phrase, ace in the hole? Is that the one? Which basically means, it could be the wild card that you can play that suddenly turns that kind of potential danger or downside into a positive. Because if you are smart about the way you do token design, you don't actually need to be that smart about marketing because the thing is going to spread itself. Obvious example of this is Bitcoin, right? Actually, there's almost nobody pushing Bitcoin from the point of view of the core team. I mean, the core team is gone, basically. And the protocol implementers that remain, that kind of, occasionally make very, very, very tiny edits to the protocol, they don't do anything for marketing. They don't need to, because the incentives in the system were built in such a way that people are incentivized to market it to each other by word of mouth. And that has been unbelievably effective for the Bitcoin network. I think that the same could be true of decentralized social networks on Arweave, video sharing sites, all of this Web3 services, as you will, all of them, I think, can make use of that same token design as marketing approach and not have to deal with such a heavy load of marketing, theoretically at least. Final point about this is, of course, that your users are now invested in your success if you give them the tokens. Okay, so there are lots of different reward strategies. Now, remember back to our mechanism design talk last week, we were thinking about, you want to have the human wants to get to some kind of sub goal on the way to their ultimate goal. The sub goal, typically, in this case, at least, we're going to use tokens. And so that's essentially more or less money, right? And we just need to insert our mechanism in the middle such that a useful byproduct comes out. And the question now is, of course, what is our strategy going to be for defining that mechanism? One obvious one, when people use your projects, why not give them some tokens? And as we were speaking about in the last lecture, the obvious way to do this is using what's called a proportional allocation rule, which is essentially what Bitcoin does, right? So the more you contribute, or you take the contributions of everyone, you divide it by the contribution of or the other way around, you divide the contribution of the individual by the contribution of everyone during a time period, and you distribute tokens proportionately to that quantity. So if I, do 10% of the mining power in the Bitcoin network, wouldn't that be nice? Then I get 10% of the rewards for each of the blocks on average. You can do the exact same thing with usage. And I think our drive really led the way on this. So they said, okay, each day we're going to release this number of tokens. And the more people upload to the R-Drive application and subsequently Arweave, the more tokens we're going to give them proportionally to what everyone else does. This worked super, super well because it grew the size of the R-Drive community rapidly. And now people are really staked into the success of R-Drive, and they are onboarded to understanding what R-Drive does. So that's a really powerful loop. Danger here is obviously incentivizing the wrong thing. It's like the genie in the bottle genie in the lamp, I think, that we were talking about last week. This idea that basically with mechanism design, you're going to get what you incentivize. And so if you accidentally just incentivize something that isn't useful or is tangentially related to something that's useful, then the effectiveness of this whole system declines. So you got to make sure that you really got to make sure that the usage that you're talking about is actually the usage you want, and nothing more and nothing less, because you can easily end up with misalignment. Okay, underexplored area is usage fees goes to tokens. So if you're doing something like R-Drive, where the number of tokens that you're using Arweave tokens to upload data might actually be quite high because you're uploading large amounts of data, you can just do something where you offset those fees with R-Drive tokens. And so this means that from the user's perspective, they're just swapping one token for another. But from your perspective, you're getting a user that has actually used your system and there wasn't like an incentive. They're not going to profit from using your system. You're just kind of subsidizing it a bit with ownership of the thing. And so from their point of view, there's like much less I mean, they're essentially more or less, in the case of most new users in the Arweave ecosystem right now, they're swapping one token they don't really understand much about for another token they don't really understand much about at an equal amount, or at an equal cost. So they don't feel like they're losing anything. But from your point of view, you're gaining a staked in user. And if you're smart about it, you'll vest those tokens you're giving to them for like 3 months or something, so that they're guaranteed to come back to claim them at some point in the future. And now you're building up an army of people that are, have used your product because they wanted to, not because they were really pushed or incentivized to. And also they're staked in. It's pretty effective. You can also obviously do some proportion of this instead. So you can say, okay, well, we won't pay 100% of the fees, but we will pay 50. You can play with all of those values. This isn't explored very much, but I would encourage people to do so. I think it's a cheap, relatively, way of running a usage reward program that is highly likely to incentivize the right behavior, because you have to convince the user that they want to use your platform anyway, rather than it being like they will make a profit for using your platform. Although there is a lot of utility to that, particularly for what it's worth in the content creation side of a two-sided market platform. So something like YouTube, for example, right? You need people to make content in order for users to be able to come along and view the content. And if you don't have that two-sided of the market, then it doesn't work. And so if you incentivize the creation of content, then that's like a very, very powerful thing to do. Anyway, let's move on. Okay, another very reasonable thing to give people tokens for is sharing and spreading the word. So I think the prime example of this in the Arweave ecosystem that's already been tested is the R-Verify system. So for a while, R-Verify, so if you're not aware, R-Verify is the blue tick for the permaweb. The idea is that it uses a modified PageRank algorithm to create a Sybil-resistant way of seeing who's a human in the network and who is not. And then every application can easily hook in to this data set and say, okay, cool. I'm going to give a blue tick next to this person's name or these people's name in my application, and none for the others. And so you can have this everywhere. It's like everything on the permaweb, it's composable, and it's trustless and verifiable. And we can get into why it's Sybil resistant another time, I guess. But it's a pretty cool mechanism. Anyway, they had a system for a while where if you if you verified someone else, so if you said, yes, this is a human, then you took part in a proportional allocation rule token distribution event each day. And so what this meant was people were posting on Twitter, please verify me, right? And this spread like wildfire. And this is probably one of the most effective, I guess, permaweb adoption strategies has ever been deployed, because lots of people saw it. And it was the nature of the mechanism itself that more people were being exposed to the mechanism as part of doing the loop. And that is obviously viral if you have the rewards set up correctly and the tasks set up correctly. I think for what it's worth, there would have been a much more effective version of the same idea if they had just said, instead of for verifying people, it was actually your verification level at the end of the day dictated how many tokens you had. And so now you're incentivized to go out and get other people to verify you. And because it's a proportional allocation rule, they're essentially fighting against each other to get more verifications from other people. And that would have been even stronger spreading mechanism. Now, R-Verify is a kind of special case, I think, where the nature of the product itself required some level of sharing or spreading of the message. However, I think you can apply this in a surprisingly large number of cases. I would encourage you to explore it, and don't just think, well, my product doesn't have a viral loop. It's just a permanent photo album app. Like it's for the users individually. It's not necessarily a multiplayer game. I really think that you can probably look into this. So, for example, in that, I haven't thought about this before, but in that particular case, you can probably do something where, well, if people share and they have a ref link, which has a token inside that's generated randomly, or actually you could just use their address, then when other people click on their link and they end up uploading data to the application, then the referrer ends up getting the token usage reward potentially, or something like this. Yeah, you can easily see a system where, well, now people are incentivized to spread the application, even if it's just like a kind of, in that case, you could call it something like the viewing layer, right? So it's the top of the funnel for getting new users in. And again, I really, really strongly advise you, if you're a kind of more technical founder, you know, the reality is building fun hackathon projects is cool, but building startups that people actually, with products that people actually use, is like 1,000 or 1,000,000 times cooler. And if you don't have much experience with marketing, this is a really easy way to hack the system. And you can focus on the engineering side and have marketing-like outcomes emerge. So I would really strongly advise, yeah, really focusing on what the mechanism designs around sharing in your system might look like. There's a ton of other things you could do that aren't explored yet at all in this space. This is the opposite of the token allocation table conversation. I think here, go wild, be creative, and test everything. The faster you can test stuff, the more information you get, and the better decisions you can make in the future. So really, just try lots of stuff. We're right at the beginning of Web3 adoption, so nobody really knows what works properly. Everything is up for grabs. One final point I would make is about essentially the investment and thesis testing and correction cycle. So at the beginning, when we were talking about the token allocation table, you had a certain number of tokens you're going to put aside to reward people for onboarding to the system, your marketing budget in the form of token rewards, right? Well, don't commit the whole quantity to a new scheme you're building or a mechanism design at the beginning. This is what was the standard behavior in about 2017. I would argue that we've learned a lot since then in the ecosystem. That really what you want to find is mechanism market fit, right? You don't, just like product market fit, this idea that you have an idea about a product, you put it into the market and you test it. You don't know that product's going to work. Actually, it's really, really hard to guess what will work and what won't work. Of course, the better you are at guessing, the better you're going to be at startups in general, but also being able to iterate quickly. So you try something, it doesn't quite work, but you learn some information about the market. Well, that I thought was going to happen didn't happen. Well, what did happen is, in the case of Arweave, for example, people picked up Arweave for the storage of NFTs before they picked up Arweave for the storage of DeFi UIs. That's not something I was expecting, but with that informed our ability to kind of shift the focus towards helping people on board that are going to use Arweave for NFT asset storage. Whereas, I also really think that in the medium term, DeFi should be a good area, but my point is that this is something that we couldn't have predicted, or we didn't predict ahead of time. And so you can course correct. It's the same with your mechanism designs, right? You don't want to say, okay, I'm giving 30% of the tokens for people doing this particular task before you've ever tried that task in the market. It doesn't make any sense. You're probably going to find that you actually, for a few times, you're going to misincentivize the wrong behavior. And you're going to, over time, slowly move the mechanism towards something that actually incentivizes the behavior that you want to see. And then over time, you can commit more and more tokens to it as you gain confidence that it's what needs to be done for the project. All right. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. I hope that was helpful in some form. Yeah, I'm really excited to chat to you in the break room, or whatever we call it. See you there.